All right. Good evening, folks. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is James Perry. I serve as CEO at the Winston-Salem Urban League. And as most of you know, this is a series of webinars that are a partnership between the Winston-Salem Urban League and the Winston-Salem chapter of the NAACP. This is Black Lives Matter Protest to Policy. Everyone deserves a safe, decent, affordable housing. And I want to start tonight by thanking several participants or attendees who've been champs and that you've been joining us almost every night. A few names that I recognize: Tasia Wilson, Ron Davis, Magali Yacinth. You folks have been real champions and have really been joining in the conversation. Magali has been some nights offering comments both on Zoom and on Facebook, which when I try to keep up on both, that's hard work. So thank you for being so involved. I also want to make sure that I recognize Alan Younger from the Alpha Pi Lambda chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. They, of course, are one of our partners, and we really appreciate all the support, particularly all the support in helping to spread the word about the event and helping to organize the event. Also, Alan was the moderator last night. I think that all of you know that these are very difficult and challenging times that were spurred, of course, by the deaths of 3 individuals, and that is frustrating as that has been. One of the things that Reverend Carlisle, my colleague at the NAACP, and I wanted to do was to make sure that their lives weren't lost in vain. That we that as much as we were protesting in the streets, that we wanted to make sure that energy was able to be translated into lasting policy. We wanted to make sure that we didn't look back in 10, 15, or 20 years and realize that while we were proud of the energy and proud that we had marched in the streets, we didn't want to look back and realize that we had not made lasting reforms. And I think what we all know is that while the policing reform is the tipping point that caused people to march, that we need reforms in a whole plethora of areas. And so that, of course, is the reason that we've talked about voting rights, that we've talked about education, that we've talked about economic opportunity, and then, of course, that tonight we're having a conversation about affordable housing. I do think that my colleague, Reverend Carlisle, will join us before the end of the night, and he will also offer a few comments. But with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce to you the panel that we have gathered tonight. And I got to tell you, I'm particularly excited about tonight's event because I cheated a little bit in putting together tonight's event. In that there's a group that I've been working with, or that I've had the opportunity to work with over the past several, I guess I was going to say several months, but it's actually been more than a year at this point. And we've been working on assessing affordable housing needs in Winston-Salem, and we've been doing that while also, I think, partnering with groups who were doing the same thing in other cities around the country. And so we weren't just working in a vacuum, we were also comparing the challenges that we were facing with the challenges that other cities were facing. And so one of the exciting things that we get to do in the course of this conversation is to compare some of what we found. And so when we talk about this idea of moving from protest directly into policy, part of what happens tonight is that we are able to share some of the challenges that we have recognized here in Winston-Salem, and then talk about some of the policy ideas and concerns and recommendations that we have. So I'd like to introduce to you our panel. First is Paula McCoy. I think for many folks in Winston-Salem, Paula needs no introduction. If you didn't get a chance to work with Paula at Neighbors for Better Neighborhoods, or if you haven't worked with Paula on one of the many boards that she serves on, or if you don't know that Paula is currently a candidate for elected office, then you must have had your eyes closed and your ears covered the entire time that you've been in Winston-Salem. But just on a personal note, I moved to Winston-Salem probably, I guess, 5, almost 6 years ago now. And when I first came to the Urban League, she was one of the first people to reach out to me and to say, come on over, I'd like to meet you. I'd like to talk to you about what it is to work in nonprofit life in Winston-Salem. And I want to make sure that you know that my door is always open. And I've always been thankful for that, Paula. And I've always found you to be someone who's absolutely dedicated to the work of moving community. And so I want to thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for your service, of course, to the community, but then, of course, for taking time to join us this evening. Paula McCoy.
Thank you, James, for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be talking about this, I think, very important issue. So thank you for inviting me.
All right. And next is Matt Weber. Matt is someone who I've gotten to know over the course of about a year or so now. And Matt is my kind of guy for one particular reason, is that he is a housing nerd. And I am also a housing nerd. I hope that you don't take offense, Matt, in that I call you a housing nerd. But he's a lawyer who knows every tiny detail about housing policy and understands it in great detail. And it's one of the things that I also pride myself on. And so when I meet someone who can best me in housing policy knowledge, they end up being someone who I want to kind of rub up against and learn more from. And so Matt is someone who is like that. And one of the things that I envy about Matt's housing policy career is that he's had a chance to work with so many people in so many different places. And so he's worked with folks in Detroit and Cleveland and St. Louis. And then because he's working with cohorts in multiple cities right now, he's also able to see the cutting edge affordable housing policy that people are implementing in multiple cities at the exact same time. And frankly, not just to see it, but also to advise folks as they engage those policies, the same way that he's assisting and advising us here in Winston-Salem. And so I'm quite honored and humbled that Matt would take time out of his busy schedule to talk to us tonight. And then also, as you'll see in a few moments, he's going to talk through the incredible housing assessment report that the cohort has been working on, and that I think Matt has been putting the most time into out of everyone involved in the cohort. Matt Weber.
Thanks, James. I think you're overselling me a little, but I appreciate it. I want to also extend my thanks to all the folks who are joining us over this dinner hour and in the midst of all of this. I am exceptionally grateful that we've had the past year to be working together. We talked a lot about racial equity in the work we've been doing in the past year. And so I think it's no surprise to any of us on our team that we're gathering tonight to have this conversation, because we've been talking about how housing is an issue of racial equity in Winston-Salem the whole time we've been doing this initiative.
Right, absolutely. And so I think maybe one way to start this conversation is just to have both of you to just offer a few brief opening comments, and then maybe Matt, for you to and maybe Matt, those may have been your opening comments, but then just for us to after that to go into the housing assessment report or presentation, and then we can have a more informal discussion or afterwards.
Great.
How does that work?
Sure. I don't have a lot to say by way of intro. Paula has been our community engagement consultant on the project and has been doing a lot of outreach. So Paula, do you want to share a little bit about the community engagement we've been doing over the course of the year, just to frame what I'm about to present?
Yes, and I apologize if you hear the lawnmower going on outside. I have some lawn care going on. I can't stop it.
We're real people.
Yeah. So it's been a pleasure working with ForEveryone Home initiative this past year. And we put together a very, assertive community engagement plan. And we have been, talking to lots of groups and lots of people about their lived experiences with housing, whether from the professional end to the people who are renting. Excuse me. And we've gotten a lot of information and a lot of experiences about a lot of things that people are experiencing. I have a passion for housing as well. Certainly, I don't have as much of a background in it as these gentlemen, but my passion kind of grew out of working with the Local Initiative Support Corporation, which was an organization that was in Winston-Salem several years ago now. And you're working with community development corporations and trying to produce affordable housing. And so I learned a lot then. And so I love to be able to continue that learning with ForEveryone Home initiative and hearing some of the same concerns that we had then. I'm particularly interested in preserving affordable housing. We have a lot of housing stock here that deserves to be preserved. And so I have a passion for helping people maintain their housing and for people to develop more mixed income housing here in Winston. So that's, you know, that's about me and my passion for housing.
All right, thank you very much. All right. And Matt, you want to offer a few comments and maybe go ahead and move into the presentation?
Sure. Yeah, so it has been really great to be working with the Winston-Salem team. It's clearly a committed team of that has both the community connections and the expertise we need to kind of move this initiative forward. I have in my PowerPoint a little summary of the process we've been following. So if I go on too long without putting that on the screen, I'm just going to repeat myself. So I think I'm going to switch to the PowerPoint, and that'll kind of walk everyone through it. Does that work, James?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, we're going to do that. All right, so you all should be seeing the ForEveryone Home and Winston-Salem update screen. All right, so as James mentioned, I work for Grounded Solutions Network. I can get my slides to advance. Grounded Solutions is a national nonprofit that works on building equitable and inclusive communities that are rich in opportunity for everyone. And we do that largely by advancing affordable housing solutions that last for generations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. My main agenda for tonight, I want to talk about 4 key points. I want to give you an overview of the ForEveryone Home initiative. I want to talk about the work we've been doing in centering racial equity. I want to share with you some of the initial needs assessment findings that we've come up with, and they're framed as initial because we do want to continue hearing from folks as to issues we missed, things we need to dive deeper on, other things you want us to address, that kind of thing. And then I'll talk about the next steps that lie ahead for us. So the ForEveryone Home initiative, it's an anti-displacement and inclusive growth initiative for mixed market cities. And it really came out of our experience working in other places where markets were super hot, where housing affordability was at crisis levels. Communities would call us in and say, hey, can you help us craft a new affordable housing policy that deals with displacement and inclusive growth? And often like that, they were calling us kind of too late. We wanted to get to do this work in places before those crises had set in, where every community has some concerns with affordable housing, and we wanted to be addressing those concerns when they're kind of that low to mid level before they hit those crisis levels for the whole community, because it gave us more room to have an impact. So we set up a competitive process, took applications from cities all around the country, and 3 cities rose to the top: Winston-Salem, Indianapolis, Indiana, and San Antonio, Texas. And you see on your screen the members of our Winston-Salem team. And it was important for us that the team have a mix of community connection, government leadership, so that we could actually advance policies in the places where we need them to, and technical expertise, so that people had the knowledge of what's actually happening in the city to help guide and shape the process going forward. And I think we ended up with a really strong team in Winston-Salem. In the initiative, we've got a set of values that are guiding our work. We do want a strong community engagement process. We are centering racial equity in the work we do, and I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. Ongoing peer learning. So we have the teams from our 3 cities have gotten together on several occasions, either virtually or in person, to exchange knowledge about what's happening in their cities, learning from each other, what works, what doesn't work. And that, I think, has been rich and rewarding exchange for everyone. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have a real commitment to lasting affordability. The idea that once you create affordable housing, that housing should remain affordable in perpetuity, because it's a community asset. It's something that subsequent generations should be able to benefit from. And so we work with local governments and communities to establish structures to actually make that happen. Overall, the ForEveryone Home process has 3 phases: a needs assessment phase, where we look at what's happening in the community, a policy agenda phase, where we are putting forth a set of policies to address the issues we've identified in the needs assessment, particularly as they relate to anti-displacement and inclusive growth. And then the final phase, where we're picking one of those sort of broad policy agenda items and really developing it in detail to the point that it can be implemented, whether it's by city council or a relevant city agency, so that we're moving not just from ideas and concerns, but to action. I want to talk a bit about centering racial equity. As an organization, we have recommitted to racial equity as a goal, in part because we got new leadership, African-American leadership of the organization, that really has made this a priority for us. And in Winston-Salem, the racial equity gap is fairly easy to see because a highway runs through it. In and around Highway 52 tends to be heavily African-American and Hispanic, and then neighborhoods on the west side tend to be white. What's really striking is that even if we put other things on the map besides race, we can still see these same patterns. And so on this map, we're looking at median home values, and you see that same pattern along Highway 52. In this case, lower median home values there, higher values on the west side. If we look at household income, we see that same pattern. If we look at poverty levels, this time the east side is high, not a good thing. And the west side has lower poverty levels. And so that pattern, that racial equity gap, shows through even when race per se is not on the map. For me, one of the most troubling maps we have is this one, which is based on an analysis done by the Census Bureau, which they call their Opportunity Atlas. So they've taken all the data available to them and are able to project what the average income in adulthood is expected to be of children by the neighborhood where they grew up. So what this map shows is that if you're growing up on the east side of Winston-Salem, your income in adulthood in the 30s is expected to be maybe $15,000, $20,000. If you grow up on one of those neighborhoods on the west side, particularly in the bright red color, you might be earning 3, 4, 5 times that amount, $55,000, $75,000 in the 30s. And so where you grow up plays far too big a role in terms of your prospects in life, given some of the structural issues that exist in Winston-Salem. And Winston-Salem is not alone in this. It's a common issue across the country, as I'm sure everyone in the audience is aware. Why is it happening? Well, a lot of it is historical. We set up this unequal arrangement from practices over 100 years ago. Winston-Salem had a race-based zoning ordinance in which the government was telling folks, if you're Black or Hispanic, you have to live in these parts of town. That got struck down. That ordinance got struck down not too long after it was in place, but it was a signal that the government itself was going to be used as a tool of separating people. When that got struck down, people turned to racially restrictive covenants, which was language on deeds that said it said people who are African American can't live on this property, or if you're Hispanic or if you're Jewish, can't live in these neighborhoods. We had federal redlining practices in which the federal government told banks that neighborhoods where people of color lived were too risky to make loans, which set up a whole process where neighborhoods got disinvested because folks couldn't get a loan to fix up their houses, they couldn't get a loan to buy houses there, and so houses declined. With the GI Bill that made it easier for whites to buy homes in newer parts of town, out in the suburbs, and created a increase in the wealth gap in the community. And we had urban renewal programs that built things like Highway 52, almost always through predominantly Black neighborhoods, breaking up the community centers, the churches, the Black-owned businesses there, and contributing to this wide gap, this wide racial divide that we see. And because of these things being in place, we still haven't been able to overcome those divisions that have deep roots in our community. But Winston-Salem's been working on that for a long time and has definitely been making progress. And nothing that we do in our ForEveryone Home initiative is going to completely close that gap, but I wanted to show here what would happen if we were able to do that. If through both ForEveryone Home and all the other things that Winston-Salem and the community is doing, what would be that racial equity dividend? So if homes in neighborhoods of color were worth as much as the median home value in predominantly white neighborhoods, Winston-Salem homeowners would have an additional $1.8 billion of wealth in the community. So increasing the tax base, giving more resources available for schools, all those benefits that would flow from that. Likewise, we'd have $705 million more spending money, annual income, if we close that racial equity gap in Winston-Salem. And if poverty levels in neighborhoods of color were as low as they are in predominantly white neighborhoods, there would be 24,000 fewer people living in poverty in Winston-Salem. And that would have so many benefits flowing to the whole community in terms of child welfare, health, school achievement, all those things that come from a more stable, less economically oppressed existence. So that helps frame why the racial equity is important. And you'll see as we go through this, we continue to emphasize the racial equity needs in our assessment. As we talk about housing, I wanted to start with this chart because it goes to what we heard from a lot of people in the outreach we've done. People talked about how pinched they're feeling by housing costs. And I think this chart explains why. So on this chart, we see the percent change in median renter income and the percent change in renter costs in Winston-Salem since 2000. And the top line, the orange line, is a percent change in gross rent. So relative to 2000, rents have been actually, fairly stable. They've gone up a few percentage points, but not by huge amounts. The big change is the bottom number, which is the percent change in median renter income. So the relative income that renters have. And we see renters took a big hit in the recession in the mid 2000s, and we still have not recovered from that. So absolutely people are paying a larger portion of their income in rent, but it's not so much because rents for the city as a whole have gone up, even though they have a bit, especially in recent years. But the bigger issue here is that income just has not been keeping pace. It has gone down. And while that too is on an upswing, we're still well behind where we were in 2000. This too has racial equity implications because, so if you look at Winston-Salem as a city as a whole, the chart on the left shows that about 46% of renters are, or 46% of Winston-Salem households are renters. But if we break that down by race, the picture is very different. In the center chart, we see that only about a third of white households are renters, while among households of color, that flips almost entirely the other way. So 61% of households of color are renters, and just 39% are owners. And so the difference in housing cost burden hits households of color more significantly. And we see that on this map. So the government considers people housing cost burdened if they pay more than 30% of their income in rent. So if you're paying more than 30%, the government deems that unaffordable. And if you look on this chart on the left, we see neighborhoods with a majority household of color. And you can see that most of those neighborhoods are colored in the darker red. So up to 75% of households in those neighborhoods are housing cost burdened. On the left, we see neighborhoods that have a majority of white households, and there the housing cost burden tends to be less. And one of the consequences of that high housing cost burden is that Winston-Salem has a very high eviction rate. So this chart shows that out of every 100 renters as of 2016, which is the most recent data, Winston-Salem was evicting 7 out of every 100 renters. And that makes it third among all cities in North Carolina in terms of its eviction rate. And if we look nationally, among other cities that are similarly sized, Winston-Salem comes in 6th with its high eviction rate. And that's because people are living so close to the edge economically that just, one issue in terms of missing a rent payment or missing a shift at work will make you miss a rent payment, and then you are facing eviction. This map again shows the difference in households, neighborhoods that are majority households of color versus neighborhoods that are majority white households. And again, you see very high eviction rates in these neighborhoods with majority households of color. Another thing we wanted to look at in the needs assessment was displacement pressures. So we wanted to see, even though rent as a whole isn't going up terribly quickly for the city of Winston-Salem compared to years past, in certain neighborhoods it is going up very quickly. And so we wanted to find where those neighborhoods were, where people are facing those displacement pressures, either economically through rent and home costs, or through other more cultural displacement factors. And we followed a methodology adopted by NAACP, the National Association of Latino Community and Asset Builders, I think, in which they identified 4 indicators of neighborhood change. One's housing costs, another's median household income, another is a number of college graduates in the neighborhood and the number of non-Hispanic white population in the neighborhood. And we looked at those figures for the city as a whole, and then looked at each individual neighborhood to see if it was changing faster than for the city as a whole between 2013 and 2018. For any one of those indicators, if a neighborhood was changing faster than the city as a whole, we gave it a score of 1. So you get up to 4, indicator score of 4 for all those indicators. And then here's a map showing where neighborhoods that were changed that got scores of 3 or 4 out of those 4 indicators. And what we see is that neighborhood change, it seems to be happening most dramatically in and around downtown, and then in some of the outlying neighborhoods of Winston-Salem. All of this is to flag this as an issue that there are people who are likely experiencing displacement, and those who are most vulnerable to that are low-income households in these neighborhoods, because as prices go up, as the businesses that operate in those neighborhoods and the services that are provided there, as those change, low-income households are the least likely to be able to weather those changes and may be forced to move elsewhere. Another issue we looked at was the loss of existing units. On this map, you see a bunch of brown dots. Those are the location of subsidized housing properties in Winston-Salem across the city. And then we've added a star on those properties if their period of affordability is expected to expire by 2026. So whenever the government provides subsidy dollars for the creation of affordable housing, it usually comes with a requirement that that housing remain affordable for a certain period, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. At some point, that affordability period expires and the owner is able to take that housing market rate. Now, research has shown that not all properties where the affordability period expires are going to go market rate. In part, it depends on who the owner is. If it's owned by a nonprofit or a public entity, it tends to stay affordable even after the affordability period expires. But that's not always the case. Sometimes nonprofits or the government ends up selling property and letting it go market rate for a variety of reasons. Another important factor is the market in which the property is located. So if it's in a hotter market, a market with higher rents, it's more likely to be converted to market rate. And so on this map, those properties with a star that are located in the yellow, orange, red zone, those are properties where we may be concerned that when the affordability period expires, the owners of those properties might take them market rate. We would need to do more outreach to those property owners to understand what their plans are, what the financial situation is, but that's an area of concern. The other risk of displacement, though, is also in areas where rent is particularly low. Because in those areas, our concern isn't that the property will go market rate, but that the owner has not been able to maintain the property in a condition where it's going to be able to be habitable in the long term. If rents are too low, they're not able to invest in rehab, they're not able to get loans to rehab the property. And so even those properties in the darker blue area may be at risk of loss if those conditions prevail. So again, these are areas where our research shows we've got an issue that we need to be prepared to address in Winston-Salem in the not too distant future. And as I'm sure most folks on this call know, Crystal Towers is a clear example of subsidized property that may well be lost because the maintenance on that property has not been able to keep it in a habitable condition, and the cost of rehabbing it may, well, I'm not going to go there. It's there's some debate about whether it should be sold off or not, and that's a conversation that needs to happen going forward. One last issue I wanted to flag for you all is the need to build more inclusive community. And so on this map, what I'm showing in the shaded areas are the number of rental units that are affordable to tenants earning 50% of area median income in 2018 by census tract. So these are these are units that are affordable to lower income folks. Lighter shading shows fewer units, and the dark red shading shows more units. And I've highlighted on here 3 census tracts that I want to talk about. There's this census tract on the west side, 3908, a second census tract a little bit to the north and east, 2703, and then here on the east side over by the airport, tract 1602. And what we can see is on this west side tract, the opportunity atlas says that if you grow up in this neighborhood, in a low income household in this neighborhood, you're expected to earn about $45,000 in adulthood. If you take that same child in a low income household and move it to the tract to the north and east, 2702 here, the expected income in adulthood is just $24,000. And if you go all the way to the east over by the airport, that expected income drops down to $17,000. The challenge here, the sad reality here, is that in this tract where your expected income is the greatest at $45,000, there are only 4 units that are affordable to households earning 50% of area median income, just 4. Whereas in these other tracts where your expected income is much lower, there are hundreds, over 1,000 units available for low-income households. So we don't need to force people to move into other neighborhoods, but I do think it's important to give people the choice. And at least in some parts of the city, low-income folks have very few choices as to the ability to live there. So next steps, as I said early on, we are continuing to do outreach on the needs assessment and on the policy agenda. I think I'll let Paula talk a bit about the study circles she's got put together. We're also soliciting input from other stakeholders. I'd love to hear from folks on this call as to their reaction to the needs assessment. We'll be taking all that input and developing our policy agenda. It is difficult in these COVID-19 times to do the kind of community engagement that we might have envisioned at the start of this initiative, but we are definitely doing our best to reach out to a variety of folks. We are hoping to conduct a citywide housing condition assessment because one of the things we've heard from folks is a concern over the condition of housing, and we want to be able to prioritize where we put funding. So we would like to be able to figure out where the need is greatest in those areas. We'll be putting out the draft policy agenda for folks to review, and then collectively choosing one of those to move to an implementable policy to present to council for forward consideration. So, and James, I think that is all I got. I'm gonna stop share here and we'll go back to our conversation.
Well, Matt, I think that was a lot.
It was. I apologize.
No, it was a lot in a good way. And I think, I was just watching some of the comments. Some folks someone said, "Wow," is all they can say. I mean, I think that certainly, one of the things that I experienced the first time that I looked at these data was that it brought to life or it validated all the stories that I had been told and all the experiences that all the Urban League clients were having, and I think and some of these data were data that I had been able to put my hands on before, but certainly not all of them, and certainly not all of them in such a comprehensive way, and put together in such a clear and direct fashion. And so it's incredibly helpful. I think one of the things that I'd like to do is to just pause here for a second. I'd like to introduce Alvin Carlisle, Reverend Carlisle, who's able to join us. Reverend Carlisle, thanks for joining, and thank you for your partnership and support. And I'd like to do something that's a little out of the ordinary for how we've done these in the past. I'd like to ask both Paula and Reverend Carlisle for their how they react to seeing these data, that so clearly talk about all the challenges and needs around affordable housing in our communities.
I think Alvin is muted. Reverend Carlisle?
I think you unmuted yourself and then I muted you back. Let me hear.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Well, I joined actually at the end of Matt's presentation, so
okay.
A good bit of the data I did miss. But what I did see, kind of like you were saying, Jen, kind of spoke to some of the things that I was already hearing about the issues surrounding affordable housing, and definitely here in Winston-Salem, just a chronic problem that we're just going to have to stay adamant about creating policy. I'm excited about the group that you all have working that is actually going to, look at this in a more consistent way. And so we're just hoping to have some good outcomes, and definitely an issue that we have intentions on staying abreast of. But again, it's astonishing to see the numbers, and it just really pans out. I think what the general thought or mindset was that affordable housing or the lack thereof, and especially how it's only the affordable housing that is available is only available in the areas that are already suffering economic depression. So we definitely need to be intentional about policy that will help create affordable housing in areas that will hopefully put young people in a place that speaks to their growth economically as they become adults. So we just have to stay on that work.
Thank you. Thank you. Paula?
Yeah, I think that, wow is a good way to describe this, but when you talk to people and you hear their stories, you kind of know that these inequities exist. But when you see it in picture form and illustration, it is a lot more compelling. Certainly some of the slides that Matt mentioned show that where we are as it relates to poverty in this city. We know that 20% of children are in poverty here. And that's pretty high compared to some of the other cities like Chicago and Philadelphia. But one thing that he said was that the people who are born in poverty, children who are born in poverty, remain in poverty. At least 45% remain in poverty as adults. And so that's pretty startling. So we know a lot of these issues aren't just about poverty, but a lot of them are about race. So that's something that we really need to work on. And so the policy agendas, the recommendations that's coming forth, Matt mentioned our community engagement strategies, and study circles are one of those that we have conducted that even started tonight. So we're having a study circle on housing. And so we are engaging people with lived experiences who are talking about this and who are thinking about recommendations that could help. So that's been really good to engage people around this, to hear their concerns, and for them to know that they can be a part of the decision-making and problem solving. And so we need to be able to respond to that with them, going to City Hall, going to the City Council meetings, and demanding change. So, thank you.
So I want to start by talking a little bit about gentrification. I think that Winston-Salem is in a unique position relative to gentrification, at least when you compare Winston-Salem to so many other cities that that have already been gentrified in really dramatic ways. And I think I know some folks have been a little upset at me at some points, because what I have expressed is that the data suggests that we are on the verge of having African American communities gentrified, but that they have not gentrified just yet. And what I saw in your data, Matt, is that it suggests the same thing. That there are that when you look at East Winston, that it is unfortunately ripe for gentrification, but it hasn't happened yet. And so if that presumption, or if you agree with that, then I'm curious about what are some of the steps that you and Paula might advise for a community that wants to defend against gentrification that could happen, and particularly a community that, as you know, when you look at those at the rents that you laid out in those in that neighborhood, I mean, they're extremely affordable right now, and it's part of what makes it ripe for gentrification. How do you defend against it? I mean, because one of the core challenges is the fact that folks are renting, and it means that they don't have ownership that could easily prevent folks from coming in and taking over ownership of properties. You're on mute.
It's going to be the theme of the night. So there are a lot of different strategies. As you said, one of the issues is that you've got a large renter population, which can put, renters are then vulnerable to what the landlord's wishes may be. One thing that some cities have put in place is a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, in which if a landlord wants to take a property, say it's a collection of rental units, and then they want to turn them to condos, they first have to make that property available for the tenants to purchase. Oftentimes the tenants themselves aren't in a position to do that, but if they're given the right to do it, they can work with a nonprofit where they can assign their right to purchase to the nonprofit. The nonprofit can work with them and perhaps set it up as a co-op building, so that the renters become owners of that building themselves, and they're able to stay there in the property. As you know, James, we're big proponents of community land trusts, which is a mechanism for putting more control over property in the hands of the people in the neighborhood. So a community land trust typically will own the land on which a home sits, and then they sell the house or the home or the whatever's on top of it to an occupant, but subject to a requirement that the property is always going to be affordable going forward. So you have to be income qualified to buy it, and when you sell it, you got to sell it to someone who's income qualified as well at a price that those folks can afford. And a community land trust it's set up to be community driven. So the tenants, the people who own the houses are on the board. People who live in the neighborhood are on the board, and they're the ones who are helping to decide what happens with the property. They're working to ensure that once people are in these homes, they remain stable homeowners. And so in the 2008 recession, we saw very, very few owners of community land trust properties fall victim to foreclosure, because they had a CLT backing them and helping them navigate those financial troubles, whereas low-income owners in non-CLT properties were being foreclosed all the time. So it can add stability, and once established, becomes a way of maintaining that community connection and a foothold in that neighborhood. It requires getting up to scale. Like, I don't want to oversell it, It requires getting up to scale. And these neighborhoods, we need to act soon enough that we can keep that foothold in the community before that gentrification wave takes place, right? I don't know. I'm wary of showing up and saying, hey, we got all the fixes. This is hard. Economics, like there's structures, there's reasons this is hard. It's meant to be hard to fight the sort of wave of capitalism coming into your community. So there are tools, there's mechanisms we can do it, but it does require like real community effort and concerted resources to make it happen.
Paula, you've been holding basically community meetings, listening circles, and talking about affordable housing issues. What have been the major themes that have been coming up in your conversations?
Well, there is, I think, probably a misconception that we are in gentrification here, that we are in the midst of gentrification. And I agree that we're probably just on the verge of it, but people are concerned. And they're concerned because they're getting calls from realtors want to purchase houses, their houses. They're getting calls, about vacant properties in the area. So people are concerned about that. And, there are a couple of initiatives that's going on in the city right now. One of them is purpose-built neighborhoods, purpose-built communities. And people are concerned that is gentrification. What it is mixed income communities that people are proposing. The same thing with the choice neighborhoods that the city that we just got from HUD, that's $30 million, which is just a fraction of what they're going to need to build out Cleveland Avenue homes. But people are concerned that that's gentrification. Again, it is purported to be mixed income housing. But if we're not diligent, if we're not paying attention, those houses that are going to be set aside to be affordable may have an affordability term, a timeline. And as Matt said, some of those now are expiring because they were only put in place for 15 years or whatever. So what we are wanting is permanent affordable housing. And so people who are involved, purpose-built is supposed to be a resident-led initiative. So if residents are at the table, and they are in Boston Thurman, they really are engaged, but they have to be diligent to make sure that the affordable housing that's put in place is permanent affordable housing. Otherwise, in 5 or 10 years, it might move to market rate. So we just have to pay attention to what's going on. And the same thing with choice neighborhoods. We have to be careful that the affordable housing there is permanent affordable housing. So those are the things that I'm hearing in the community whenever we are looking at, hopefully, some new production of housing, that we're careful that it doesn't turn into market rate housing in a few years.
Matt, I'm curious, are there challenges, affordable housing challenges that you see that are unique to Winston-Salem? I mean, you've worked in so many different cities over the course of your career, and right now you're working with so many cities across the cohort. Are there problems or challenges that we have here that are either unique challenges you've never seen anywhere else, or is there some unique twist or version of our challenges that are particularly different?
Yeah, I think so. Just comparing the cohort we're working together in Indianapolis, San Antonio, and Winston-Salem. Winston-Salem is a much smaller city. I think one of the challenges that goes with that is perhaps a capacity issue, particularly with the affordable housing developers. It's development of affordable housing requires a certain expertise, and just having that base of knowledge and the ability to navigate all those different regulations. I think we could do more to build up the capacity in Winston-Salem to do that. And I think bringing philanthropy to the table will help us a lot. I think the other thing I'd love to see in Winston-Salem, and we've talked about this, James, is an affordable housing trust fund where we're able to, as you saw in the presentation, there's a really good chance that a lot of units that are currently affordable are going to lose their affordability restriction. And we need some source of funds readily available to take up those properties as they become available and put them in hands of nonprofits and rehab them, very likely, to maintain their affordability. And I think that other communities have maybe more of a funding infrastructure. Right now, Winston-Salem is largely dependent on the funds we get from the federal government, and those have been dwindling year after year. And having our own independent source of funds would really give us more freedom and ability to deal with those issues.
So one thing that that really struck me both in the presentation and then also as a news item was the really high eviction rate in Winston-Salem, and obviously, and Matt, I know that we're kind of regurgitating a little bit because it struck me multiple times, both because, and I think the first time was when I learned that the number one the entity who had the highest eviction rate, the landlord who engaged in eviction most often is the housing authority, the Winston-Salem Housing Authority, which really shocked and upset me, frankly, because their job is to provide housing for people who are on the precipice of homelessness, and instead of doing that, they of course were the organization that was causing the highest rate of homelessness because they were evicting so many people. So that's the first time it shocked me. The second time was when I saw it in the needs assessment, the draft needs assessment report. And then when I looked at the eviction lab report, which I think I realized later that you had been kind of looking at that report as well, Matt, I was shocked again to see that it wasn't simply that it was high, but that Winston-Salem quite literally ranked high when compared to other cities. And so, so obviously, we need to directly address the housing authority and to address their policies. For my just to be really frank, at any point that a housing authority is constantly evicting their tenants, I think that housing authority is failing. That's my own very frank opinion. But outside of that, I'm curious about what are the other policy changes that have to happen in order to lower an eviction rate and ensure that we're able to keep people in rental housing for a longer term.
Yeah, and I really want to emphasize the importance of doing that because so Matthew Desmond, who did the research from that eviction lab, one of the things he likes to he tells people is that eviction isn't just a consequence of poverty, but it's also a cause of poverty, because eviction is so disruptive to people's lives. It makes you miss work. You lose your possessions because the landlord just throws stuff out on the curb and you can't take it with you. Kids miss school. There is just a whole list of troubles that flow from eviction, and then it gets hard to get your next unit, and you end up in a new neighborhood, you don't have the network, all that kind of thing. And so I emphasize that because I feel like folks, like, we all talk about affordable housing, but eviction is a plays a critical role in kind of in destabilizing people, and we really need to address that. I don't want it to be a non-sexy issue, as it were. So I think there's things we can do in terms of tenants' rights to strengthen people's ability to stay in there. Like there's three phases to all this. We need stronger rights at the front end. We need assistance in the middle, so greater access to legal aid in that eviction process, because very often what's going to help folks most is if folks have an attorney who can even just buy them time to get into that next unit, or to negotiate with the landlord so they don't have an eviction on their record, just an agreement that they'll get out by a certain time. And then on the back end, we need increased funding for to help them find their new place. And I should have mentioned on the front end, we need more resources to keep people in their homes, because honestly, it's cheaper to keep them in their homes than it is to do all that other stuff down the road. So if we can increase that, those grants, and here we are in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis, absolutely, like, renters, tenants are going to really be bearing the brunt of that, and we need ongoing assistance for those folks to keep them stable and in their homes.
And Matt, you mentioned COVID-19, which obviously has just dramatically changed the landscape of everything. I'm curious, and this is for you and for Paula. How do you think that COVID-19 changes the housing landscape here in Winston, across North Carolina, and frankly across the United States of America?
Mm-hmm. James, I wanted to say something about.
I'm sorry, please.
I just wanted to mention that a lot of people know that people get put out of their homes, of their apartments, because they can't pay the rent. Bottom line. But there are other reasons why they get put out, and sometimes it's because they're complaining about the conditions of the housing. And so when they complain, the landlord, puts them out of there. So and so the information that Matt shared is that it's not just about poverty that people get evicted. It's just about race a lot of times. The eviction rate is disproportionately high in minority communities, and so we all know that in minority neighborhoods, it's 4 times that of the annual eviction rate. So I was reading some statistics about I think it's they say that every percent increase the population, the eviction rate increases by 1.2%. And so if
you were breaking up there, can you repeat that data point?
I was saying that this was happening in Richmond, that for every 10% increase in the population, the African American or minority share of the population, the eviction rate increases by 1.2%. If in the white population increases at the same rate, the eviction rate shrinks by 0.9%. So you have to wonder, is it just about poverty? I think that there are some things that happen. I know that the minimum wage, absolutely, we should advocate for that. If rent went up, people's wage down, that is going to be a problem.
Hey, Paula,
Mm-hmm.
is this true for everyone else that her vocals are jumbled? Yeah, we can't make out your audio. Your audio is jumbled for us. I'm not sure what's going on there.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's working right now. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, I'm just saying some of the things we can do is, of course, increase the minimum wage. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Matt mentioned legal representation. A lot of people who get evicted, they don't have lawyers to represent them, And so here locally at Wake Forest University Law Clinic, we were talking about setting up a clinic in East Winston. And this would be very helpful to help people as they're being evicted, that they can have legal representation. Now, since COVID, I don't know where that stands or if it'll happen. This COVID is such there's so much uncertainty that we don't know when we'll ever get back to normal. But I would advocate, and I don't know if this is a federal policy that we have to adopt or what, but rent control. If we could apply rent control so that rent just doesn't keep going up and people not being able to afford to rent an apartment, that would be helpful. So those are the ideas that I have. I think also around inclusionary housing, you talked about some other things. We have inclusionary housing here in Winston that's not used. People don't use the inclusionary housing. There's no incentive for them to use it. But we certainly need to find some way that we can increase that particular policy that we have around inclusionary housing. And if folks don't use it, then there should be a fine or something that could then contribute to the affordable housing fund that we need. So I hope you heard this. I'm seeing a message saying that my speaker is not working. So.
And what about COVID-19? What do you think the effect will be of COVID-19 on the Winston-Salem housing market and beyond?
James, I'm going to continue to not answer your question for a moment.
Okay. Sure.
Because someone in the chat asked, what is inclusionary housing? And I just wanted to expand on that for Paula. Inclusionary housing is when the government requires that a certain portion of housing in a development be affordable at some level. Sometimes it's affordable to kind of moderate income. Sometimes it's affordable to lower income. In some states, you can impose mandatory inclusionary programs where if you build a housing development over a certain size, you have to provide a certain amount of affordable housing. In North Carolina, we are limited to voluntary programs where we can incentivize developers to provide a certain amount of affordable housing, but not require that. And so the challenge there is figuring out, are our incentives the right size to get the level of affordability and affordable units that we want? And what Paul is saying is that the incentives we have just are not being used by developers, and as a consequence, it's not producing the kind of affordable housing that we want. So that's a policy area where, and actually Grounded Solutions does a lot of work on inclusionary programs. So that's a policy area where we might be able to gain some ground. And as Winston-Salem continues to develop, become a more inclusive community that way. So that said, now I'll switch to COVID-19 unless Paula wants to take us in a different direction. Great. So as Paula said, it's hard to predict. I think the thing I am most nervous about is a repeat of the 2008 recession pattern, where we saw the foreclosure crisis really devastating Black neighborhoods, communities, and then large real estate investment trusts and others with a whole bunch of money on hand swooping in, taking up those properties that have really low property values due to current economic conditions, and basically changing the whole ownership scheme in those areas. And then when the market recovers, really increasing rents or selling them at inflated home prices, all to the disadvantage of the low-income, usually African-American folks who used to live there, or maybe still live there and now are getting displaced. There are a variety of programs out there that are trying to soften the blow of COVID-19. I just really worry that it's not enough given the scale of the impact.
And Paula, did you have COVID-19 concerns or thoughts?
Okay, so mine are similar to Matt's. You know, I'm afraid that we could experience a housing collapse like we did in 2008. But I think that right now maybe home sales could drop, and I know I was hearing from my realtor that traffic to places like Zillow and I think it's called Redfin or something, where people go to look for real estate, that has dropped by almost 40%. So people aren't looking for housing. It's also, you know, when you're looking for housing, it's a sort of a in-person kind of transaction. People have to do appraisals, and you know, folk have to come out and do inspections, and you know, you got to have these closings. That's usually in-person kinds of things. Amid COVID, that's not going to happen, and so you're going to see an impact of housing sales because of that going down. People not, you know, not looking for housing. And I think also a lot of our building materials come from other areas. So we'll probably see a spike in housing materials, or even the supply of those might be diminished. So I think one of the best things that could come out of it could be low interest rates. And so people should take advantage of that and refinance their homes. So, so I think there's a lot that can happen amid COVID-19, but it's so much uncertainty still that we just don't know what's going to happen. I know that there have been moratoriums on foreclosures, so that's been a safety net for people, that folk can't do the moratoriums. I know here locally, there was some rent, some eviction moratoriums. I don't know if they're still in place. I wonder once they're lifted, what's going to be the effect of that. And I just think it's going to be devastating. But you know, I think we have to take this wait and see position.
So Paula and Matt, let's say that we get off of this Zoom tonight, and then all of a sudden, Mayor Allen joins, and Mayor Pro Tem Adams, and Councilman Taylor, and I can keep going down the list of all the members of the council. They are incredibly inspired by the conversation tonight, and they call the two of you, and they say, "Look, we think that this is the moment, and we think that we can pass one affordable housing, one piece of affordable housing policy, or we think that we have the ability to get it through." And so I want to put you on the spot. What would be the if there was one most important piece of policy that to push? What would you recommend to the city council and say, this is it? This is the if you can only get one thing through, and you got this one opportunity in this one moment, what would be the policy? It's, you know, tough question, right? Because you got this whole world of policies, and you have so many problems and challenges. But sometimes, you know, politics doesn't really line up perfectly with. Not sometimes. Politics never lines up perfectly with with what you want and need in a perfect policy world. So if we had that one shot, the one opportunity, what is the policy that you would propose?
I'm going first. Mine would be to create this affordable housing fund. You know, we need resources in order to build affordable housing. And so, you know, how can we do that? Whether it's, as I said, through the inclusionary housing fund, find people, you know, that may not be something that we can do locally, but certainly we can have some kind of tax increase that you can put that money into a housing fund or, you know, something like that. But I think we have to have the resources. I think there was like $10 million that the city had set aside for affordable housing. That's a drop in the bucket. You know, one project could use those funds. So we need resources.
So for me, like I would pass a package of tenant protections. And that answer is driven in no small part by this sort of commitment to racial equity. Like more than 60% of renters are people of color. They are absolutely the most vulnerable set in our world of people who need housing. So I would do a set of protections that, you know, both increase their rights, but also provide the resources, the counseling, the set of referrals they need to find other housing, that whole set of supports that would help them avoid eviction. Like that to me feels like the most critical intervention. Let's deal with that safety net and then build from there.
And then let's take it a step higher, right? So you know, the city council has one set of powers or authorities. Let's assume that it's the governor and the state legislature that calls. And you know, there's a question that's been lingering in the question answer section that came from earlier. It was, is rent control something that the state government must advocate for? Generally, that rent control is a state government action. It's not something that you can do on a city level. So if we stepped it up the next level and it was the governor and the state legislature that said, we think we can get this one thing through, then what would be the policy ask or the policy push that you would recommend?
Yeah, and I think you hit on it. I think, you know, to the extent that these are structural issues, a lot of states, including North Carolina, have like at the state level, it's the state level that's kind of reinforcing the structures. Like they are preempting the local government from addressing these in terms of doing rent control, in terms of doing mandatory inclusionary programs. So if I were advocating something at the state level, it would be to end this local preemption, allow the city government to adopt the policies that it thinks the city needs, and really, because given that freedom, we could do a whole lot more to address those structural issues that we outlined at the beginning of this.
Yeah, I agree with that, because people in Raleigh or Washington, D.C., they don't know what's going on here. Not you know, and how people are being impacted. You know, they may statistically have some numbers, but they don't really know how people, or the pain that people are in around housing. You know, and I know that we need what, 13,000 more housing they say the next 10 years. We probably need them now. And so we have to find a way to be able to create that, produce those housing, as well as what Matt said, preserve and protect, preserve the housing that we have and protect the tenants from you know, the inequities that exist around housing.
So we're at 6:48. We don't have that much time left. I want to just take some time, Matt and Paula, and just do a little bit of kind of definition work, because one of the things that I've seen happen in the comments here is that people have asked, well, what is inclusionary housing? And they've asked how some of these tools work, or what are some of these tools. And so, so I just want to get you guys to talk some about them, because obviously, if we're going to try to move this energy into policy, I think it's really helpful if people who are so interested that they would take the time to join this kind of call. It's helpful if they know and understand the actual policy that we might end up putting forth at a later point. So So what about, so we've talked about, I think, community land trusts, we've talked about inclusionary housing. Is inclusionary housing different from inclusionary zoning?
Great question. So yes and no. So inclusionary zoning is often a phrase that used specifically for zoning. You put your requirements in a zoning ordinance. Inclusionary housing is a slightly broader term where there are other mechanisms a community might use to achieve more inclusive housing that includes a mix of affordable units and market rate units. So that also goes to incentives and other things that encompasses incentives and other things that inclusionary zoning itself as a term might not refer to.
And what about, so one of my favorite tools is the low income housing tax credit. What could, obviously we could we could spend an entire evening on it, but kind of briefly, what is it and why is it important?
Yeah, so the low-income housing tax credit is the federal government's largest source of funding for affordable housing, and it's run by the Internal Revenue Service. It provides, so investors put money into affordable housing, and in exchange they get to take a tax credit on their taxes, so it's a discount on their taxes, and typically states have each state has an allocation of tax credits, and then they put together a competitive process where projects all apply for some portion of those tax credits. And then if the project gets awarded those tax credits, then the project looks for investors to sell those tax credits to, because the investors want to be able to take that discount on their taxes. It typically, so this is all funding for rental housing. Typically it comes with officially a 15-year, well, officially it's a 30-year restriction on affordability, but the federal government only enforces that for 15 years. At least that's the only period when your tax credits are at risk. And then after that, it becomes a little bit softer in terms of enforcement. So Winston-Salem has quite a number of low-income housing tax credit units, and those are some of the ones that are due to expire in the next 5 years.
So in the Facebook conversation, there are a fair number of questions, or not questions, but posts about home ownership. And but we spent a lot of our time talking about rental housing. I'd love if both of you would just offer some about the role of home ownership, or of affordable home ownership in this process.
James, I wanted to say something about low-income housing.
Oh, please. I'm sorry.
Just to mention that, when developers apply for low-income housing tax credits, they are scored. You have to get a certain score based on if there are certain things close by that when you're building, if there's a grocery store, if there's this or that. One of the things that they get scored on is the poverty rate. So if the poverty rate is low, then they get a higher score. I have been really shocked in my going out to neighborhoods to see almost completely African-American developments on the outskirts of Winston-Salem. So that's where poverty is low. And so that's where mixed income housing, or not mixed income housing, affordable housing can be built because you get a higher score. So my fear of that is that what's going to happen is that when we see gentrification, we're going to see more minority communities on the outskirts of Winston-Salem, and more what I call white in-flight, people coming back into the inner city. And so those are one of what I think disadvantages of the or unfairness in scoring for low-income housing tax credits. I just wanted to say that.
And then on the home ownership front, James, I would say it absolutely is critical. I think especially when we're talking about racial equity, if you looked at those numbers, such a, a third of people of color are homeowners, households of color, homeowners in Winston-Salem. We really do need to find a pathway from rental to home ownership if we're going to impact those racial equity concerns.
Yeah, home ownership is certainly one of the paths to wealth. And so people have equity that they build in their housing. And so we certainly want to see that as a way for people to be a wealth. So moving more people to home ownership is ideal, but everybody doesn't want to be homeowners, and we have to keep that in mind too.
And then one last question is, so when there are public-private partnerships for housing developments, and developments are intended to be permanently affordable, how do you hold the developers responsible over the long term to make sure that they hold up their end of the deal and keep those units affordable in the long term?
Yeah, so that requires a monitoring infrastructure in the city. And the city, Winston-Salem actually does have that kind of infrastructure in place. Often though, what works well is if you do have a community land trust or other kind of entity that's dedicated to that long-term thing, it actually works better for developers if they can just transfer over those units to a community land trust or other entity to do that kind of monitoring, because they don't want to deal with it.
Well, so folks, we're at 6:56 p.m. We try to end on time. I want to say thank you, Matt and Paula. The two of you are a dynamic duo, and just an absolute wealth of information. And I also want to, for everyone who's listening, I want to provide just a little bit of clarity in that the needs assessment that Matt presented earlier is going to circulate a little bit. I think it's going to get presented both to the City Council and to the community a bit more. And then once that's done, there'll be some further process so that the cohort can get feedback from the community and then begin to create some policy concepts from based on the needs that have been uncovered. And so that's going to be a bit of a process, but I think what we're all hopeful for is that it'll be a process that really draws on both on the true needs that are in the community and really draws based on true input from the community. And so we're really excited about that process. I think we're all frustrated that the data is frankly very frustrating, but we think that having a very organic process, I think will get us hopefully in the long term to the right place. So again, thank you all for being so giving of your time. I want to thank all the attendees who've joined us on Zoom, and particularly folks who've joined us night after night. I also want to just note, thank you, Terry LeGrand. And it did not go, I did notice your high level of interest in knowing what the state legislature would do about affordable housing. That was, I appreciated your interest in that. And I want to give a shout out to Aaron King, who joined us this evening, who's also part of the cohort. Jessica Kennedy, I don't think I've ever said your last name, Jessica, but you've joined us several nights in a row. I want to thank you for joining us. Also, Gloria Hairston, Eunice Campbell, thank you for joining us. You've joined us, I think, at least 2 or 3 nights in a row now. Thank you. We appreciate you for joining us and giving of your time. Reverend Carlisle, any parting comments before we head out?
Only thing I would just like to say, we heard plenty of good information tonight. I just want to encourage everybody to stay active, look for Matt's report, and let's try to stay connected so that we can make sure that we establish the kind of local policy we need to address. I think Paula quoted the number at least 13,000 new We need affordable housing units that we need right now. So I think it'd be good if during this season, we just make a active decision to stay connected, make sure we can continue to work together, maybe advance some policy issues that can address our serious issue of affordable housing here in Forsyth County. Then the last thing I want to do is wish Alan Younger, amen, happy birthday, amen. He's been our partner in this process.
Happy birthday, Alan.
Yeah, him and the Alphas have been supported in this process, and so we want to shout him out. Wish him a big happy birthday. But thanks, James.
All right, happy birthday, Alan. And folks, tomorrow night we'll talk about reforming policing and criminal justice reform. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Bye-bye.
Good night.